And then she kind of asked about connection. Well, what about the connection in tango? And I didn't really have an answer because to me, it's all about connection. You learn tango and you learn all that stuff, and then you learn connection as a separate thing. Let's talk about connection in tango. Just by way of background, last year I was in Thailand, and while I was there, I was writing the book, which I have finished. Today I'll be talking about some of the material from that book. I unearthed through arduous research a whole bunch of interesting stuff about tango history, and that might be interesting to history buffs. I've been uploading some historical recordings of tango onto this channel, maybe the Romantic Tango Revival, and I noticed that there's a good amount of interest being expressed. People are actually enjoying these uploads. And so I think people who are enjoying that will be people who generally are interested in history, and in particular in the history of tango. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about. And a good part of my book, even though the book is putatively about how to dance tango and tango movement, is actually for the most part about tango culture and tango history. Then I can give people free copies to read if they are willing to give me feedback and write reviews. Anyway, I'm going to be talking about the stuff in the book, and maybe that will help people decide whether that's something of interest to them. I came back to Australia, went to Brisbane in a hostel, and it was New Year's, and I wasn't really in the mood for partying because I guess I'm too old, and I've done all of that stuff too many times. So I was just working on my laptop. It was like coming close to midnight, and there was a woman who started chatting, and she it turns out she's learning tango, and I told her, well, I wrote a book. She was a little bit surprised. This guy wrote a book about tango. Doesn't look Argentinian at all. Doesn't sound Argentinian. And then she kind of asked about connection. Well, what about the connection in tango? And I didn't really have an answer because to me, it's all about connection. You learn tango and you learn all that stuff, and then you learn connection as a separate thing. I didn't have an answer to that question, but later on I kind of thought about it, and yeah, it is an issue. But getting that connection in tango is connection something that's separate from everything else. What exactly is the connection in tango? And so I try to kind of relate that question to my book, and how does my book address the issue of connection? And I guess I was thinking about what are the kind of the basic principles that I follow in thinking about something like learning tango. And I feel that there isn't really a huge difference in learning different things, like, for example, learning a language, learning to play an instrument, learning music. And the basic principle that I follow is that you learn when you understand. For example, if you are learning a language, you learn when someone is speaking to you in a foreign language, let's say, and if you understand most what they're saying, roughly, like most of it, then you're actually picking up that language. Right, so for example, I'm learning Portuguese and I'm reading some basic stuff in Portuguese, or maybe watching the news in Portuguese, in Brazilian Portuguese. And then as long as I understand most of it, I'm learning. And so the question was, well, how can you understand something if you don't speak the language? Well, you know some of the language, and then you also have context to help you to understand. Right. So the key term here is context. The context clarifies the situation and what is being talked about. So, for example, if I am in Brazil and I say something to the person in Portuguese and they respond, and even though I only understand half of what they're saying, the situation tells me roughly what they're talking about, and so I will pick up a few more words or phrases or a bit more grammar just by the fact that I know roughly what they're talking about in that situation. So the context of the situation helps you to learn. Now, there are different contexts, there are different kinds of context. So the situational context is one kind of context, and another kind of context is the context of the culture right? So if you understand the culture, then that will help you to learn the language as well, right? If you're learning a language without kind of in a decontextualized way, without access to cultural knowledge, then that will make it more difficult to learn the language. And there's a bigger context to that, and that's the context of the history, right? So without understanding the history, it's actually difficult to understand the culture. So even if you kind of know the culture, you know bits of it, it's not coherent if you don't really understand if you don't know anything about the historical background. Things become connected, as it were, right? And when they make sense, when you start understanding them, and the way we gain that understanding is through this kind of situational, cultural, and historical context. And this is something that philosophers have been discussing, and there's a science or a discipline of hermeneutics which emerged from attempts to translate historical texts, like very old texts, like very, very, like hundreds and thousands of years old, right? The way we linguists approach understanding for example, Egyptian hieroglyphics or some stuff like that, like ancient Greek or ancient Roman. The way you develop an understanding of that language, and then what various texts are talking about is by understanding how the parts relate to the whole. So once you understand, for example, this book is a book in philosophy, or this book is a book in politics, or this book is a book on religion or something, right? Then you know, okay, well, that tells you, okay, so the different phrases and sentences and words will refers to something related to that. Your understanding of the specific phrases then feeds back into the understanding of the larger whole. So hermeneutics is kind of a circular thing where you understand the parts by understanding the whole, and you understand the whole by the parts also inform your understanding of the whole as well. It's called the hermeneutic circle. That is my basic approach to things like learning a language or learning about the music and the dancing of tango. That how you approach, for example, the movement of tangos, well, that's going to fit into a larger whole, and it depends on how you understand this larger whole. And currently we have a particular understanding of the whole, which is not historically informed. In other words, people don't know, like let's say someone takes a tango lesson or a lesson in any dance actually, they will learn the movements, but they will learn them in a kind of a decontextualized way, right? There will be no cultural or historical information about where this stuff came from, like why do you do this particular movement? And the general justification for the movements and everything is kind of aesthetics. The problem is that aesthetics is, again, relative to the culture, and something might look pretty or sound nice or whatever, but that doesn't mean that it actually provides aesthetic satisfaction in a more kind of meaningful and long-term sense, right? It might provide temporary pleasure, or you look at that and go, oh, that looks nice, but culture is more about kind of the more permanent stuff, right? Does this actually work in the long run? And that question is never really addressed, and there's a reason for that. It doesn't, right? What I decided to do is to look at the history, and so when I was researching my book, I was researching. I started kind of reading more about the history of dancing in general, and I discovered some very interesting stuff, like the fact that, for example, there have been dancing manuals written in Europe since like the 1400s, and the way that I kind of started out on that journey is when I discovered that actually Latin music, so-called Latin music, comes from contradanza, and contradanza, well, where does the word contradanza originate? Well, it originates with the English word or phrase country dances, and these were originally English country dances, which really blew my mind, because the assumption is that the English don't dance, and that all the dancing is from Latin America. And when you discovered that actually South American or Latin American dances originate in part, not wholly, but in large part with English country dances, well, that's really not something that we learn, and it seems just totally contradictory to our current understanding, right? So the English, maybe they don't dance or they don't do partner dances. I don't know whether they do, but that's the general assumption, right? I was talking to a Colombian salsa teacher. I said, well, actually, dancing comes from Europe, and his response was, well, Europe is boring. That's a kind of the knee-jerk, assumption or response. Well, Europe is boring, and all the culture comes from other places. So when you say when you kind of discover that actually the music and dances of South America come from Europe, and in large part from these country dances via France, via Spain. In France, contradanza, and then in Spain, and then the Spanish-speaking countries, it's contradanza. And in Cuba, it was called danza. The music and the dancing traces back to English country dances. I also discovered in my research that in the 19th century in Argentina, they were importing all kinds of European dances, and so before tango, it was it's over the 1800s. Before tango, it was the mazurka, something called schottis. I think it's from Germany. So the waltz. The waltz has been around for quite a long time, and they were dances derived from the French minuet. One of the primary sources for this kind of stuff is Carlos Vega, Vega, and he was like a major musicologist, and there's a center, like the whole musicological institute devoted to, named after him. His argument is that, and this is in Estudios para los Orígenes del Tango Argentino. What he's arguing, based on the evidence from printed material, so newspaper articles, and things like theatrical productions and stuff like that. His argument is that tango emerged around the 1880s, and the way it emerged was not as a thing, okay, like something that people dance at candombe festivals or anything like that. No. It was basically in Buenos Aires. The culture was quite liberal, and there was a lot of dancing going on over the decades of the middle 19th century. There was a lot of dancing going on, and there were people coming from Europe introducing dances, and these were mazurka, the schottis. They were dancing waltz, polka, gallop, mazurka, and schottis. These were kind of the main ones. And so mazurka might be familiar to fans of Frédéric Chopin, who was a Polish composer from a French background, and then he actually moved to Paris. But his father was a French soldier in Napoleon's army, and he settled in Poland. So Chopin was born in Poland. He moved to Paris, and he composed a lot of his classical music based on Polish themes, like the Polonaise, which is a Polish dance, and another one is the mazurka. So a lot of mazurkas that were composed, famous mazurkas that were composed by Chopin. And Chopin is a very important figure in 19th century Romanticist classical music that probably influenced forms like tango music. So what Carlos Vega argues is that basically there were these dances, and they started to be danced with something called cortes y quebradas, which are breaks and stops or cuts, con corte, con quebrada. And I try to find what in Spanish people understand by the term corte y quebrada, or in dancing. As far as I can see, it just means something like a sudden turn or a sudden stop. So these would be innovations only if there was nothing like this prior to that. So if you look at dancing prior to that, it would be either walking or hopping, and maybe some turning. But first of all, dancing with a partner where you're just holding the partner continuously that was relatively new around the 1860s. Okay. And then I think what people started to do is to make sudden kind of jerky movements, okay, sudden turns. And also they would kind of previously the posture was just an upright posture, and the quebrada, the break, was a break at the hips. In other words, the idea of going down with your body and then turning suddenly was new. Okay, and so that was called corte con quebrada. So basically, breaking at the hips, not staying upright, and then sudden turns, sudden jerky turns, were something that people thought that was kind of fun and unusual and interesting. But the thing is, they weren't dancing into any music that was called tango. They were just dancing all the other dances. They were dancing the mazurkas and the other dances, con corte y con quebrada. This was kind of a Buenos Aires kind of choreography or type of movement that was specific to that area, but there wasn't a particular specific dance that was separate, okay? And also there wasn't any music that was separate at the time. So tango music emerged out of a combination of the mazurka and the milonga. The milonga was another dance that was not tango related. It was just a kind of a contradanza, a type of contradanza, I guess. A combination of the milonga music and the mazurka music. Then you start getting this other kind of music. And then the term tango, which was around already since the 1860s for some completely unrelated folk dances, there were actually published music and published description of the dance. It was completely unrelated to tango. That to what we currently understand as tango, the word tango just kind of became attached to this new form, dancing con corte y quebrada, and then to this new musical form that was now separate from the other forms, right? So those things kind of congealed into the tango, so that when tango became internationally popular around 1910, that was it was already a unique national form by that time, by 1910. It wasn't marginal. It was already kind of dispersed through Argentine society and recognized kind of as a national dance in Argentina. Now, not everyone liked it, but generally it was not just consigned to the margins as is being claimed. So, because the standard narrative is that it was on the margins, and then it became popular in Paris because of the aristocrats who attended, the brothels in Buenos Aires, and then they took it to Paris, and there's no evidence for that. It was more that it became popular in France because already Argentine musicians, like respectable Argentine musicians who had money to travel, would actually take the music, like the music was already being written down, composed and written down by the time it went to Paris. So it wasn't just a kind of this marginal thing. You had to take the music as it was written and then take it to Europe. So so by 1910 or early 1900s, it was already formalized, and it was already considered to be kind of uniquely Argentinian and a national sort of form. There were people who didn't like it, but so there were disagreements within Argentina whether, in particular, some upper classes did not approve of it, but I don't think it was uniform. I think there were some people who liked it and some people who didn't. So this is something that I discovered that was very interesting and provides very useful, I think, historical context. In terms of how this relates to what we are doing today, and just to go back to the issue of connection, how does that help us with connection? is this what we are supposed to be dancing today? My position is that what I like, which is tango milonguero, which is what you dance when you go to Buenos Aires, and there's like those milongas that are in the center of the city. They're packed, and it's a particular kind of social and cultural context. That kind of cultural form, the tango milonguero and the milongas in the central Buenos Aires, so like El Beso, Paracultural, that form emerged between the 60s and the 80s, something like that. So it's not traditional in the sense that it's not something that people were doing in 1900s, or even the tango that was being done like internationally in the 1910s and so on and so forth. And there are videos of how people danced in the 20s and 30s. Like there are videos from that period, and you can see how people danced, and you can kind of see what the corte and quebrada is, because they do these kinds of jerky movements. And I might find some of them and maybe make a playlist or something on my channel. There are some similarities and there are some differences, and I think the way to think about it is that the tango milonguero emerged more recently, based around the golden era tango music, so the 30s and the 40s. It's difficult because the way the tango music evolved, as I said, tango music was already, the tango, including the music and the movement, were already kind of formalized, in particular the music, by the 1910s. So by the 1920s, like those orchestras were considered to be like Guardia Nueva, like the new guard. They were considered to be modern. It's interesting to see how people talk about modern dances or modern music in the 1910s and 1920s. What we would consider to be the old stuff, Vieja, Guardia Vieja, they consider to be the Guardia Nueva. Problem is that the recordings, there was the beginning of the recording technology. First kind of electrical recordings were, I think, 1925. So the big batch of electric recordings we're getting that are of good quality are from the 1926. So prior to that, there were a lot of recordings, but they were using this acoustic technology where you had this giant tube, and the orchestra would just pump the sound into this tube, and it was a mechanical process, okay? And so the quality of those recordings was very, very poor. But that doesn't mean that the quality of the performance was very poor. It's just what we are getting is just a very poor facsimile of the performance, right? But when you're starting to listen to the music from 1926 onwards, the quality is much better, and you can hear that the quality of the performances was very good. But what happened is that by the 1930s, the orchestras and the whole music industry became much more commercialized. And so that music is very good. The problem is that I think they started thinking about music in terms of dancing purely or mainly. And these large orchestras, they are difficult to listen to, and they're difficult to dance to. So the tango milonguero, like let's say I was dancing at Milongas del Centro in Buenos Aires, and they're playing golden era tango music. Well, I had like already over 10 years of dancing experience, and I found that it took me, it wasn't easy, like I eventually I got it, but I already had a lot of dancing experience under my belt, and not just tango dancing, but tango milonguero dancing, like in a close embrace. And if someone is new to tango, it's just really difficult, I think, and in particular in a crowded sort of milonga situation, which is the situation in Buenos Aires. I mean, the dancing floors are large, but they're packed to the brim. And then when you go to the other countries, how empty they are by comparison, and for some reason, and some people go, well, it's packed, you're dancing too close to me, and then I'm like, really? There's like a half a meter between us. Why don't you go to Buenos Aires? Oh, we're not in Buenos Aires. This is not Buenos Aires. Like, well, it should be. It should be like Buenos Aires, because that is the experience of tango, really. And just people just don't understand just how much more enjoyable it is to dance on a really packed dancing floor with very little space. It's actually really, really cool. But people want to do their moves. They're obsessed with their moves. Anyway, So where was I with that? So Tango Milonguero emerged much more recently and on these punk dancing floors. But the thing is that the Epoca de Oro music is really, really cool. It's really great music. But the thing is, it's really, really hard to dance to. So people don't really listen to it. And so they don't really connect to the music because it's not easy to connect to. Like it's kind of advanced level music and requires advanced level of skills and understanding and stuff. It's already very advanced. So really, when I started thinking about it, and I started, what happened is I started communicating and reading the stuff of Enrique Binda, and he has his stuff on academia.edu, published a book with another guy on a history of tango, and he's been uploading like the early tangos to YouTube, and he basically thinks that that's really the golden era of tango, is the 1910s and 1920s. And I started thinking about it, and I started agreeing with him, because I started listening to that music more without prejudging in terms of, the DJ set and stuff like that. The DJ set mentality. Yeah, if you are a Buenos Aires DJ, well, that crowd, they're like an advanced level crowd, okay, and they understand the music, they're familiar with the music, they've heard, like, listening tangos, like they would have heard Gardel, they would have heard the early tangos. They didn't learn necessarily by listening just to that stuff. And the other thing is, even if they did, the DJs do play certain tunes more repetitively. There's more, I think, repetition of certain tangos, so people can get used to them. Anyway, it's another more complex issue about how you kind of get your head around the music. But what I kind of discovered through Enrique Binda's kind of stuff and research is that the early tangos are much more accessible. And so, let's say you have some tunes by Pugliese. Well, it's very difficult to listen to Pugliese. It's great dancing. I mean, it's really emotionally very satisfying, very challenging. I mean, it can really mess with your head. But I just could never get around to listening to it. Just listening to it. I love the sound of it. I'd love to dance to it, but just to sit down and listen, it's just too much. Now, I have to say that I generally find orchestral music difficult to listen to, and I prefer solo or chamber music, right? So quartets, quintets, I can hear each instrument, right? I prefer that kind of stuff. So maybe if people prefer like orchestral music, they're actually used to it, they like it, they can sit down and listen to a golden era orchestra, that's made up of 8+ instruments, like with 3 bandoneons, 3 violins, etc. But I find it difficult, and so for me, the 20s music is much more accessible and much easier to connect to. So to sum up, I would say that in terms of connection, understanding the historical context and how Tango Milonguero emerged, and then also how the other stuff emerged, the stuff that people are learning, like where that came from, and then then making a decision which one is the better one, and then also understanding how the music evolved. That provides the context for for learning and then developing that connection. The connection is really based on the understanding, right? You connect in music when you understand what it is. You connect in dancing when you understand why are you doing these movements rather than those movements. Like, what are the movements that you should be doing that allow you to connect to the music, to your partner. And then also in terms of culture, there's that connection. How did the culture of tango emerge? Because people are refusing to follow the norms of the milonga, the códigos, I keep pronouncing it in the Portuguese way, the códigos, how that emerged and why. understanding context for that, I think, is really important. So that's where I think the connection comes from, is understanding the cultural, historical context, and then also the situation of dancing and why things fit in a certain way.